let's start out with your imagination as a child. One of the things that we're always interested in when we talk with achieving women such as yourself is how did it all get going? What do you regard as the key influences on your life and the way you saw the world when you were a child? Who made that difference in giving you the aspiration and the confidence to begin to do what you've done?
Well, I think that, well, my family, of course, but my father, my aunt were the adventurers who convinced me that I could be what I wanted to be, and I just had to set my mind on a goal and work to get there. I wanted to be an adventurer. I loved the swashbucklers, the old Errol Flynn movies, you know, and even remember having an early conversation with my mother, which I said I was going to stow away on a tramp steamer and see the world. And she responded, but girls don't do those sorts of things. And I was furious. Like, what do you mean girls don't stow away on tramp steamers and see the world? I mean, why not? And so that why not question has driven everything. The why not? If it's right, if it's proper, if it's appropriate, if it fits and comports with, you know, what you believe, then why not? And for me, I think part of the blessing and the curse has been that I have never let race or gender be part of the why not for me. To say that you can't do something because you're a black person has never been an excuse, a legitimate reason in my worldview. To say you can't do something because you're a girl has never been a legitimate reason in my world. And I say both blessing and curse because you have to be mindful of those boundaries. You have to be mindful of convention, sufficient to even position yourself appropriately when you're going to defy them.
When did you first have the sense that, hey, you know, I could be a leader, or some version of that? When you were in grade school, when you were in high school, how did you view yourself or what you could do?
I'll tell you something, that has been one of the more difficult aspects of my own sense of self, because I never really saw myself as a leader.
In our interviews, this has been a common theme with incredibly achieving women such as yourself. I never saw myself as a leader. Pat Schroeder said, I don't see myself now as a leader.
Yeah. That was not something that I aspired to be, or that was in the goal. It was always a matter of what can I do to express my vision, my worldview, my sense of propriety. What can I do to contribute? What can I do to reach out? What can I do to help other people? And quite frankly, I think the helping others came very much out of the kind of moral upbringing, if you use the word, because we were raised to believe that was how you found value in this life, was what you gave back.
Did you have, am I right, a brother and a sister, or were there three?
There were four of us.
There were four of you.
Yes, I had one brother who's deceased. My brother who's with us is a police detective, Chicago Police Department.
Was that following your father?
Your father was too, yes.
Yeah. Joey is the detective, and he's a sergeant now, so that's, you know, like got rank in the detective zone, whatever that's called. But anyway, and my sister Marcia is a lawyer also, and she does consumer protection law.
And she's younger than you?
She's younger. Both of them are younger.
She was inspired to do. I mean, when you went to law school, not that many women were going to law school yet. It was that moment when the idea began to appeal to more women, or at least the idea that it was possible.
Well, in my case, it's funny. I had actually wanted to be an art historian. That was my interest. My father, who was himself a frustrated lawyer, his mother, in fact, never forgave my mother for marrying. I mean, when my father married my mother, he was in law school, and the fact that he never finished law school was like a major deal in our family. And my grandmother, paternal grandmother, never forgave my mother for it, because as far as she was concerned, it was all Edna's fault that he didn't become a lawyer. So this is kind of floating around in the house. And so when I got ready, when I got ready to graduate from college and didn't know what I was going to do next,
What did you major in?
Political science and history and economics and sociology. I took all those kind of, but I had wanted to go to U of C in art history, and it started talking about, because I liked history. I liked history, and art history just fit with other interests I had. And my father convinced me that I couldn't make a living as an art historian. And that's where, frankly, the law school idea came from. He kind of nudged me in that direction.
It's interesting how many of us, even back then, had fathers who thought that we, as daughters, would have to make a living, and didn't assume that a living would be made for us. I mean, I majored in English, and I loved to read, and my father was the one who said to me, it's great that you love to read, but you can't make a living majoring in English.
Right.
I did it anyway, but but he said that, and he assumed I'd have to, I guess.
Well, again, remember that culturally, in terms of the black community, it was an automatic assumption. I mean, that is actually kind of an underlying theme that even has some problematic aspects to it, because no black woman starts off with the notion that she's going to be taken care of. You know, not even in the fairy tales. I mean, it's just not
right.
And so the assumption always was, in fact, if anything, the pressure on the girls in black families often is more severe than it is even on the boys, which is tragic, because what it winds up doing is giving you men who are themselves, well, I'm not going to go down this road, that's going to get me in trouble, but you see what I'm saying. It is very difficult, and so for all of us, the idea that you had to get yourself ready to take care of yourself was like just an assumption. Now, how you did that was the open question. And in my case, like I said, my father just couldn't envision me making a living doing art history. Now, he's wrong. I mean, in hindsight, I could have gone to work for Sotheby's or Christie's or something, and gone around the world and hung out with all these high-flown art people, but but at the time, that's what he saw.
Did you have a circle of friends in law school? Were there women among your classmates or others with whom you were able to relate and help you get through some of the tough moments there? And then how did you, it's not automatic, if you're training in the law, that you think government, but how did that happen in your life too?
Well, there weren't many women in my class.
Again, let's
I
just
started,
get that on the record. You entered law school in the early 70s?
No, 69.
69?
Yes, I graduated law school in 72.
Right.
So I started in 69. And there weren't a whole lot of women. One of the women, in fact, who I kind of lost contact with, is actually very active in Washington, D.C. Esther Furster, at the time, Esther Lardin was a friend in law school, and so I made friendships, yes, with women in the class, and some of which remained and stayed active, others which kind of fell by the way, but the other women in the class were very helpful. We also had a woman. The University of Chicago was a different situation. We had a slightly different situation because we had a woman professor. Her name was Soya Menchikoff, and in hindsight, I think Soya really did mentor me in ways that I don't think fully appreciated or understood at the time. But I think having a woman professor who was able to be both supportive and critical. Soya was the old Brunhilde mold, okay? Sorry, but anyway, but at the same time, having her pay attention to what was going on with me in my legal training was very important. And then you mentioned the government. Well, that actually happened. That was largely serendipity. I had an offer coming out. Obviously, law school was a very prestigious one, and I had an office from a big prestigious firm when I came out of law school that I turned down, and so as to do community work, or what I thought was community work. So I signed it with a little boutique law firm, and we were going to do housing stuff for poor people. And it turned out that they weren't really doing housing stuff for poor people. They were just building houses and making themselves not poor people. So it's like, wait a minute, what's wrong with this? Well, I bombed. It was a horrible, well, not horrible. It was just a work experience. It didn't really fit. The people were very nice, but it was just not a go. on any level. And then my husband, I had met my husband at the law school. And he knew a guy who was an assistant United States attorney. And the U.S. Attorney's Office was run by Republicans at the time. I didn't realize the politics of it, frankly, but they were in a hiring mode. And so he said, well, come on down and apply at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I did. And Michael, my husband, who we weren't married at the time, Michael encouraged me to do it. And when I went for the interview, I sat across from the fellow who was the U.S. attorney. He later became a very famous lawyer. Actually served on the 9/11 Commission, one of the members of the commission.
Oh.
Jim Thompson.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember sitting across from him, and I said, well, he said, you know, you get to the question, are there any skeletons or anything that we ought to know that might be embarrassing to you or to the government? And I said, well, my father was an activist. Oh, that's not a problem. I forgot what the second thing was. And then I said, and I'm living with a guy. And that was the second thing. I'm living with a guy. And they were like, oh my God. And then I hung my head and said, and he's white. And Thompson jumped out of his chair and said, oh no, that's all right, that's all right. So for the next couple of weeks, he said, well, when do you guys get married? We can't hire you till you get married. I said, well, we're planning to get married anyway, you know, in August, and we did. So we got married, and I started work the Monday after he came back from my honeymoon.
What did your husband do?
He's a lawyer.
He's a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We met in law school.
Oh, okay, that's right. Sorry.
And he's actually from this part of the world. He's from Westfield, New Jersey.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And you had a son.
Yes.
Get that on the record too.
Yes.
Who is now
27.
27.
He's in graduate school at the U of C. He's a computer scientist. He's in computer science.
So he hasn't, so far at least, followed in the steps of his parents.
But I
think
he will.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that he will. And I keep telling him that. And his father keeps telling him, go get a job. You don't need to go to school anymore. And I keep saying, Matt, go to law school, get it over with, you know.
Get it over with.
So you worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and tell us, because I do want to make sure that we talk about the various elective offices, well, the various elective and appointed now offices, because you have a broad experience and a very important one and a historic one. But you started out in that favorite of all places, the legislature. How did that happen? How did you go from
the U.S. Attorney's Office?
How did you get the idea?
Well, the U.S.
For a state legislative seat?
Well, I didn't exactly. I mean, again, this is all just life. This is the path, my own path, I guess. And I worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I think I stayed there for almost 4 years. Left when I was going to have my son. So I became a homemaker. And I wasn't a homemaker. It's funny because I look back, and when I look at the actual dates, I wasn't at home as long as I thought I was. At the time,
it felt long.
It felt long. Well, not it felt long, but I actually enjoyed it. I mean, it may not be politically correct to say it, but I really liked that stuff. And so I enjoyed, having dinner parties and, just kind of spending my day taking the baby out in the stroller and walking in the park, because we lived in an area of Chicago that was surrounded by parks. And so I'd go up to the park with the baby and go to the museum and piddle around in the neighborhood. And, I was running a household. And so it was a lovely part of my life. It was a lovely time. But I was pushing Matt down the street one day in his carriage. And one of my neighbors, who was also a stay-at-home mom, came out and said, we're going to protest the Park District's decision to build a golf driving range up in Jackson Park. And I said, oh, really? She said, yeah, why don't you come over tomorrow and join us? Well, it turned out the Park District was going to build a golf driving range in this area of the park where the species of rice birds who were very rare in Chicago. I say who and not that, but anyway, they were very rare in Chicago, where they lived, the bobolinks, and it was going to run the bobolinks out and destroy their habitat. So we were all very upset about this. So we went out. In fact, I still have a picture from the local community newspaper that shows me with the sign, Park District no, bobolinks yes. So we were protesting the bobolink removal. And so I joined the protest with my neighbors, including some of the bird watchers and people who were interested in park issues. And that was the end of that. We lost. The Park District built the golf driving range, but we did what we could. Some people say we chained ourselves to trees. We didn't really, but it was one of those things. But then our state representative retired a few months later. I was sufficiently not part of the political establishment that when the same woman had the retirement party of the state rep, I wasn't invited. I mean, she had a party at her house for Bob Mann was his name, for Bob Mann, and I wasn't part of that circle, so I found out about it the next day. I'm pushing Matt down the street again, and she says, oh, I had a party for Bob Mann last night. He's retiring as state rep. I said, oh, that's really nice. He's a good guy. And she said, oh, yeah, he's terrific. He says, we're going to be looking for a candidate to replace him, and I think you'd be terrific. And I said, oh, not me. I mean, what do you mean? Oh, well, I had all the excuses. I don't know anything about politics. I got a, young baby, my white husband. I mean, all these things. And so she
And
said,
you were how old?
I was 30, maybe 31.
You
Yeah.
were, I can fill that in for you, actually, because we've just done a project about young elected officials and taking a look for the first time at how many people come into office, elective office, under age 35. And so I'm attuned to this now. And when I was looking at the chronology in preparation for this conversation, I thought, there she was, at age 31, she was in the legislature. You were part of a very small group of people, not only a woman, not only African American, but also you went into office at an early age. So you were elected to the legislature, you were only 31.
Yeah, that's about right. Because I dated in connection with when I had Matt, you see.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I was young and I mean, the naivete is just, when I look back, it is just stunning.
What was the most naive you were about it?
The politics. I had no idea about the politics. I knew policy, you see, from my years in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I did a lot of work in policy issues that we're still debating. I handled one of the first cases defending Jimmy Carter's health care reforms. And so I really got into the weeds of health care policy, and frankly that has stood me in very good stead these many years later. I can talk about health care policy and debate it with anybody because, I mean, I actually read the early statutes. I know the law, and so and knew the policy debates because we had this litigation. So I did a lot of health policy. I did a lot of litigation in housing, and so got a chance to understand the architecture of national housing policy in the United States because of those cases. Environmental law, I did some environmental cases, and at the time when we were just beginning to have environmental laws written. And in fact, had one case, we had the Calumet River, is one of the rivers in Chicago that had been so badly polluted, and I remember one of our exhibits was this fish that had tumors all over his head, and he was in a jar that we put on the end of the council table for the judge to look at this fish. Well, I could tell stories like that. But anyway, so I'd done these things, so I understood the policy. Because of my father and his influences and just the kind of conversations at home, I understood a lot of the philosophy underneath the policy and knew where the philosophical divides were. The politics, however, were absolutely foreign to me, alien even. I had always voted, but my father wouldn't vote in primaries, for example, because he didn't want to have to declare his party. And so he made vote in general elections, but he didn't vote in primaries. And so I didn't identify in a party sense at all. And so when I got ready, when Kay Clement was the woman's name who made the suggestion, when Kay first came to me with this idea, it was like, oh, well, that's interesting. And I went back to Michael, and I told Michael what, the conversation we had. And and I said, oh, and I just told her I didn't think so. And he said, why not? I think you'd be good at it, was my husband's response. So I still didn't bite. And then 2 things happened back to back. Some friends of ours, who I had always thought we had a good relationship with, called to say could they come by and for coffee. So it was kind of strange. So they came by, and we spent some time that evening talking with them, and they were trying to convince me that I shouldn't get involved because the independents, you had the Democratic machine in Chicago, the Daily machine, and that was really kind of it in Chicago. I mean, there was no Republican Party to speak of. I mean, there was, and in fact, and that's an important footnote in telling my story as a legislator, because Illinois at the time was one of the few states that had a cumulative voting multi-member district system. We had a proportional representation system in our state, which meant that every district had both Democrats and Republicans. So while theoretically there were Republicans around, in fact it was the Democratic machine. And so I had no connections to the Democratic machine, didn't know. My father had been a civil rights activist, and so that was absolutely outside of what the machine was about. But the independents, apparently, the leadership had decided on who they wanted to be the candidate, and it wasn't me. In fact, it was another woman, which was okay, because in the end it came out fine, it came out great. But at the time, it wasn't me, it was this other woman, and who was more tied into the university and things like that. And so the second conversation left me a little perplexed as to what was actually going on. Then the third came when the local independent voters had their meeting, and there was a political pundit who still to this day doesn't miss an occasion to say something nasty about me, but anyway, he stood up in the meeting and said, "Don't run. You can't possibly win. The blacks won't vote for you because you're not part of the Chicago machine. The whites won't vote for you because you're black, and nobody will vote for you because you're a woman." And when he said that, it was like, oh yeah, you just turned on all my jets. So I went home that night and told Michael what happened, and he offered to give me the seed money to start a campaign. And that's how it started.
That's how it happened.
That's great. I'm tempted to go into all kinds of responses about how that compares to other women and the decisions that they made and the way they were encouraged. We don't have time for that at the moment, but it's
it fits a pattern.
Well, some
That's
of it.
great.
I mean, the fact that you didn't wake up in the morning and say, "I'm going to run for office," the encouragement from others, and it's just very much a part of a pattern. And even when you say. And even when you talk something about being a woman, and I'm thinking about Shirley Chisholm and what she said for forever, running for Congress, running for the presidency, that being a black woman, race was less of a problem than gender in people's reactions. Nobody wanted that. Nobody wanted the woman.
Right.
There were people who didn't want a black woman, or a black man, but nobody wanted a woman.
And there were, and what you find is that what Kimberly Crenshaw calls the what's that word she uses? The intersectionality of race and gender.
Yes.
Can mitigate negatively or positively. There are times when being both black and female is a positive thing. There are times, however, when they both come together in a negative way. And so as a result, for example, in that first campaign, because it was then an open seat since Bob Manning retired, there were 10 candidates for that seat. And 8 of them were black males, me and Barbara Flynn Curry, who right now is the majority leader in the Illinois legislature.
Yes.
The black men all ran against me. Didn't lift a glove in terms of Barbara, but it was all running against me. And I was like, why are they doing this? I felt really put upon that I had to put up with not just campaigning and getting elected in the kind of the bigger sense. But I was the one, the target of everybody's arrows, if you will. As it turned out, what happened was kind of almost ironic, and this was the good ending, was that I won. I came in first. Barbara came in, actually first she came in third. And so the other incumbent Democrat thought he had won the election. She thought she'd lost. She went off on vacation. They did an official certifying count on the vote, called her in the Bahamas to come back because she won by however many votes, 34 votes or whatever it was. She won that election. So in that election, 2 women went to the Illinois legislature from our district alone, and there were other women elected around the state, both Democrat and Republican, and they called it the Year of the Woman in Illinois politics.
Well, I'm tempted to ask you lots more questions about the experience in the legislature, but mindful of the time, and also you've just given the lead for making that jump to the next level.
The Year of the Woman,
which was the so-called Year of the Woman. In 1992, when the press started to talk about it that way, I fought it because I didn't like the designation. I thought it was our century and our time, and nothing was going to get turned around in 1 year.
That's right.
But in fact, 1992 turned out to be a remarkable year.
A watershed, yes.
Yeah, we don't want to say we only have 1 year, but it turned out to be a remarkable year. And you were a remarkable part of that. And the story about what happened with the hearings for Justice Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill were all part of the story that year. But then in the elections in November, you stepped forward and you decided to challenge an incumbent United States senator and enter a primary. And then I think it wasn't the same story, but in fact, in the end, you benefited from the fact that another man entered the race and voters split their votes, and you marched forward and won a seat in the United States Senate and became the first woman from Illinois in the United States Senate, the first black person from Illinois in the United States Senate, and I think the list goes on of the barriers that you broke. And the whole country knew about Carol Moseley Braun. And I didn't want you to have to say that about yourself. I wanted it on the record. You were a national figure, and certainly to women around the country and those of us who were excited about these strides for women in politics in 1992. And they were in the House and with you in the Senate. But then it became a very complicated experience, those 6 years in the Senate. And they ended up only being 6 years, much to certainly my disappointment, and I think a lot of other people's, and probably yours too. And I want you to talk a bit about that Senate experience, the highs, the lows, what it all means looking back from the vantage point of 2004.
Well, that's a lot of story, but to summarize, I think that in the first instance, again, a lot of it has to do with the politics. All politics is local, and I don't think truer words were ever spoke, frankly, because it starts with what happens and what happened in Illinois. I took on and defeated an incumbent Democrat, which had ramifications that I frankly should have foreseen more looking forward in terms of my position in Illinois politics and how I would be regarded, supported, or opposed by other Illinois politicians. I ran essentially against the party to get elected, and I won both a primary and a general election. The reason I was able, and in the primary, remember, of the women who ran, I was the only one who ran against an incumbent, who defeated an incumbent senator. And as much to the point, our primary was first in the country, if you look at that. And so because ours was first, it gave a boost to women candidates across the country, many of whom, I'm told that one of the other women senators got a 20-point bump in her poll numbers just by virtue of the fact that people could see that it was possible, that a woman could, well, if that black girl over in Chicago, in Illinois can do this, then we certainly can do this out and wherever. And so because of that, I think women across the board it became the fashion. to vote for women in that election.
Talk a little bit about the courage or whatever it was that motivated you initially to make that leap.
Well, I was actually preparing before, when I left the state legislature, I served in executive office in county government. I did that at the behest and almost as a favor to the late mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington.
Mm-hmm.
He was a reform mayor. I was going to leave politics. I was going to go and practice law. I'd had it with the legislature. My marriage had broken up. I was now on my own, a single working mother. Matthew at the time was still in grammar school. And so I determined that, it was time for me to just go get a private life and attend to my personal affairs. But Harold wanted me, between Harold and Bobby Rush, the congressman, they said, oh no, you can't leave, you're too important to us, we've got this, that, and the other. So they convinced me to stay in Chicago, that I wouldn't have to travel. That was the inducement, that I wouldn't have to travel to Springfield anymore. I could stay at home, attend to Matt, and hold this job as part of Harold Washington's reaching out into the county. And so I took a job in county government as a recorder of deeds. No woman had ever been elected countywide in Illinois, just to show you the politics, right? Nobody had ever been elected countywide. And so Ori Paczynski and I were the first women elected to executive office in the county ever in that election. Well, Harold Washington died shortly, actually before the election happened. He died right after we had been nominated. But I went through and took the job and did what I was supposed to do, and I like to think reformed the office and made it better for the people who worked there. But after 4 years, that was it. I was done. And again, going back into the private sector, I had lined up a job with a law firm, and that's when Bush 1 nominated Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. Well, I'd been close enough to the legal community to know Clarence Thomas's reputation and where he had been as a jurist, as a public person. And frankly, for someone whose whole life had been made possible by Thurgood Marshall and the Warren Court, and the legacy of the Warren Court, it was just incomprehensible to me that this would be the new Thurgood Marshall. I was so offended. And I know this is going on the record, and he's still a sitting Supreme Court justice, but I was offended. And so I took on the Thomas nomination at home on the grounds that he was not Supreme Court material, and that Bush could find a more competent, more qualified, and certainly more less extreme member for the court. And when that happened, people started to tune in on my criticisms of the Thomas nomination. And then, if you recall, there was this 2-week hiatus when the Senate shut down its hearings. And then when they reconvened, that's when we learned about Anita Hill. I wasn't close enough to the action to know that was what, but that's what so then the Anita Hill hearing started. And I don't have to go and explain that to you. I mean, that was such a hideous, and women everywhere were just outraged at what was happening. I went and had a conversation, a personal conversation, with our incumbent Democratic senator. Paul Simon had been very clear that he was not going to support the Thomas nomination, but Alan Dixon was one of the waverers at the time. And I had a conversation with Alan Dixon in which I said to him, Senator, this is very important for a variety of reasons. I talked about the civil rights movement and the Warren Court and Thurgood Marshall and the legacy. And as much to the point, I talked to him, because he was always a practical politician, I talked to him about what it meant to black Democrats, that for us to see someone like a Thomas promoted by the Republicans, just a huge slap in the face for those who have been laboring in the vineyards of the Democratic Party. Dixon didn't listen or didn't care about that, and frankly, probably, I don't know what his motivations were, but in any event, he not only voted for Thomas and supported the nomination, but then went on holiday and shut his office down for the couple of days following. Columbus Day holiday was that Monday, I think, or that Friday. It was either Friday or a Monday, I forget, but it meant that his office was closed for 4 straight days. And the result was that people who were calling to protest his vote got no phones answered. They got no response, nothing from all over the state. So by then, the women in the state, particularly, a lot of people in general, but particularly women, were just furious with the incumbent senator. And there was this other rich guy who had vowed he was going to put $5 million of his own money in the race, running. And so he was the one that took out on against Dixon. I just campaigned, took the high road and campaigned based on what I wanted, what I believed was the right message for the state. Lo and behold, when the votes were counted, I won the primary. And so that was step A. And then, of course, Republicans around the country saw a window of opportunity to take the seat with the fellow who right now is the Undersecretary of the United Nations. Rich Williamson was his name. And so Republican money and operatives started pouring into the state. But because it was a presidential year, and I think this does make a difference, it was a presidential year, so Bill Clinton was running. And the result of that was that he kept the Democrats home, mostly. So I didn't have to have an internecine fight within the party for the general election because there was too much at stake, the presidency, and winning Illinois was at stake. So they stayed home, the Democrats stayed home in the general. I then won the general election. And like I said, the blessing and the curse was that I was able, that made me the second African American in the 20th century to be elected to the Senate. There were only two in that century.
And the other was a Republican.
The other was a
Ed
Republican,
Brooke of
Ed Nant, that's
Massachusetts.
right.
So you were the first Democrat.
First
and
Democrat,
woman.
first woman from Illinois, lots of stuff. And got there, got to the Senate, and I think even before I got to the Senate, the brickbats started like almost immediately. And that's where I think I'm convinced that a lot of that was more as much gender-based as having anything having to do with race. Being a single woman, I think, made a huge difference. I think if I had been married, it might have, I would have had the Jerry Ferraro problem, obviously, in terms of, what your husband does and this, that, and the other. But when you're single, what you have, instead of an answer to all the questions that get raised, you have a big question mark. And people can play on mystery and mystery easier than they can on a certainty. And so the fact that I was a single woman, that I was involved with my fiance at the time was the fellow who had managed my campaign, who had helped get me elected. And all that did, and he was not an American. So all of those things mitigated in favor of my personal life being made this big deal. And to this day, I really think that was really a lot of what drove a lot of the negativity. The press was hideous, as you know. I couldn't get a good press review on even the best thing. I got appointed to the Senate Finance Committee, the first woman in history to get a permanent seat on the Finance Committee of the Senate, which is, one of those powerful committees in the Senate. And it got negative press. I got no positive press getting appointed to the Finance Committee. And so from the beginning, it was just one thing after another. The good news, accusations of misuse of my campaign funds and not showing up to things when I was there. Stories ran for a long time that I didn't show up for Senate orientation. Meantime, there's pictures of me on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times at Senate orientation. It was that sort of thing. So it was just one negativity after another being rolled out that contradicted anything having to do with the facts. I mean, at the end of the day, on the campaign finance thing, which dogged me through the first part of it, it came out that we had accounted properly for every penny, except we had over-reimbursed somebody by $311. Out of $10 million, it's not too bad, So, but by then, it was in the water, it was out there, and it made it very difficult to run a re-election campaign. I'm grateful that in the re-election campaign, I lost that re-election by less than 2 percentage points, and I was outspent by 3-1, which is another thing, talk about press. It never got talked about really in the context of how much money was spent to beat me in that election. But the guy I ran against was a multimillionaire who used his own money, raised some money, and acknowledged that I was outspent 3-1. I was the first Karl Rove victim outside of Texas. He came into Illinois to do this guy's campaign. So it was some real heavy guns, and again, I only narrowly lost that election. So I felt, in hindsight, I feel really good about my state and the people of my state, because they not only made it possible in the first instance, But in spite of all of that drubbing, really we're largely able to see through it. And I think the proof of the pudding in that is that Illinois has just recently elected Barack Obama as the new senator. And so I think that speaks volumes about the state, about its people, and that makes me very proud.
Is there, I heard all about this, heard about all of this from a distance, read about it from a distance, never went to Illinois and heard up close. But it was tough. It was tough to hear.
Oh, it was horrible.
Because it was, coming at you in a number of different ways. So what I'm hearing you say now is there was not a shred. You didn't make any mistakes.
No.
You wouldn't do it differently.
Oh, no, I do a lot of things differently. But there was not a shred of truth to any of the accusations of wrongdoing. I guess that's a different statement. And to the point that I have been so often vindicated, my integrity verified by so many different official bodies, I don't even bother now when a reporter says something. I don't even get defensive about that stuff anymore, because anybody with any interest at all in the truth will look at it and discover what the record is, and the record is very, very clear, Ruth, on all of this. And so and that's how it was when I got confirmed. I got a funny Jesse Helms story, but when I got confirmed, I got a 98-2 vote on confirmation. The only people who didn't vote for my confirmation as ambassador was Jesse Helms and Peter Fitzgerald, who had spent so much of his own money to beat me. But and that was after all of the issues that had been raised in the press had been not only raised, brought out, revealed, documented. I mean, all of that. So we went through the case, if you will, bit by bit, step by step, and there was no there ever. I knew that all along. But when you're in the hole with people dumping stuff on you, it's a little hard to
And to be, Eleanor Roosevelt said in her autobiography when she was named to go to the UN that when a woman takes on something, she takes it on for all women. She's seen as representing all women, and that's true for any pioneer, really. And so you have a whole audience of people everywhere for whom you become something that is almost unfair in terms of the burden and the responsibility, at the same time that it's wonderful and inspiring. So you really were that, and you're right. I as you told the story, I remember that moment now in the elections when you won, and so then it affected as I recall, the Pennsylvania race,
That's
Lynn
right.
Yackel
That's
after
right.
that, and then Patty Murray out in the state of Washington. It
then
just went
California.
around the
That's right.
country, women running for the Senate that year, and it was your victory, your story out of Illinois that inspired so much of what happened the rest of that year. So you were carrying that with you.
Well, yeah, and I paid the price. But the fact is that and you're right. I think if there's a disappointment on my own part, it's that not only it wasn't just me going through that. It was my family went through it. It affected my family in just horrible ways, and we won't go into the weeds on that part of the story, but it affected my family very badly, and I felt so bad that because I had not adequately lived up to the political small p challenge of what I was doing, that people were disappointed. And to the extent there was disappointment, I felt, what's the word I'm looking for? On the one hand, because I knew that there was no substance to any of the accusations of wrongdoing, I could rest easy in my own virtue, if you will. I could stand on the solid ground of knowing I had done the right thing. I had not made any mistakes. So that part, personally, was very edifying. But the perception was otherwise, and it was in the perception that the embarrassment to me personally and to all the women who had invested emotionally in my victory, that's where that came. And that's what was so hurtful to me. And still continues to be on some level. I don't think it'll ever go away.
Well, do you think that the recent discussion, when you were talking about how the brickbats started almost as soon as you got there and the negative press, I remember a little bit later, but it was this same episodic beating up that Hillary Clinton, in a moment of exasperation, called the vast right-wing conspiracy. And I remember at the time, people laughed at that. Now, David Brock has written his book about the Republican noise machine and has had his conversion, and he's getting out all of this story. And what we are realizing is that the apparatus that had been assembled seemed to be in operation and just generating story after story.
Right.
And do you feel that you were part of that?
Well, there's no question about that, but what made it worse, and again, a large part of the disappointment, I mean, Hillary Clinton dealt with it from the perspective of being First Lady and kind of on top of the heap for the Democratic Party. I was getting it from other Democrats as well, you see. And that goes back to the whole Alan Dixon thing and coming in the way I did. That it wasn't just the vast right-wing conspiracy.
Yes.
There was a conspiracy, if you will. They were joined in the conspiracy by folks in my own party who, and to use a Southern expression, had no problems with throwing a rock and hiding their hand.
Well, let's shift to there were a number of incredible moments in your career in the Senate, but I think one that galvanized a lot of us was the story of your encounter with Jesse Helms. And we'd love to hear you tell it, and we want to get this recorded because it was so special and so extraordinary.
Yes, well, the first one, Encounters with an S, but the first one and the one that was the most famous really came about on one of those days. You know, you have the days you wake up and say, what did I do to deserve this day? We were in hearings, confirmation hearings on the Judiciary Committee for Justice Breyer. And Orrin Hatch had started a debate with the justice around the whole issue of choice. And, you know, I've always been, you know, adamantly pro-choice legislator. I believe in the woman's right to make her own reproductive decisions, etc. But I'm a lawyer too, and had legal training. So Hatch made a comparison between the judge's decision in Roe v. Wade with the Supreme Court decision of the 19th century called Plessy versus Ferguson. Now that was the decision in which the court said that a black man has no rights that a white man need respect, and gave rise to the beginning of what really was American apartheid and Jim Crow segregation. So for me, I'm sitting there on the committee, and here's a senior member on the Republican side comparing Roe with Plessy versus Ferguson. I was beside myself. So I'm trying to be calm because I knew this was on television and everything. I'm trying to be senatorial and debating Orrin Hatch, which was a big step. I'm a freshman. I knew this is like really tugging on Superman's cape as far as the legislature, the Senate was concerned. So I start this debate with Orrin Hatch. In the middle of the debate with Orrin Hatch, my staffer comes in with a note to say that Jesse Helms has just picked up a bill that I thought I had defeated, that had been originally handled by Strom Thurmond. The Strom Thurmond had a bill to give a patent to the Confederate flag. I defeated it in committee. Jesse Helms revived it and went to the floor to try to revive it. And I needed to come to the floor right then to take on Jesse Helms. So I had to leave the committee, having just had one fight with Orrin Hatch, make my way over to the Senate, and get there, and Helms was holding forth about the nice little old ladies of the South who do fundraising and this, you know, they deserve this, they've had this patent before, there's no reason we shouldn't give it to them again. And so I made the point, well, wait a minute, you can't, this is a Confederate flag. Why would the United States Senate be giving its imprimatur to a Confederate flag? So I make the, you know, kind of dispassionate legal argument, and I lost. The Senate voted to grant the patent, whereupon I said, oh no, this can't happen. And so I said I decided to filibuster, which of course is the nice thing about the Senate rules. So I kept the floor and proceeded to start a filibuster. And the filibuster itself became very emotional. That's what most people saw, was the emotional debate that happened during the filibuster at part of that argument. And it was all extemporaneous. It was, you know, it was just that. It was a filibuster. And happily, the members of the Senate, hearing that this thing had just exploded, if you will, on the floor, started to come back and change their votes. And one legislator after another changed his vote. And I think the moment that almost brought me to tears on the floor was when Hal Heflin, who was the senator from Alabama, got up and said, my grandfather fought for the Confederacy and I'm proud of my heritage, but this symbol is a divisive symbol in America and we need to get past race. We need to get past this. And when he made that statement, that gave cover for some of the other Southern senators to come along. And so it was almost like we were, refighting and helping to resolve the Civil War in a nice way on the floor of the Senate in the context of
it was over three-quarters the vote, finally,
It wound up being 76, 75, something like that. It was three-quarters of the members came. And the other thing, which I think isn't recorded as much for posterity, so I'm glad we're doing this, was how good people felt.
Mm-hmm.
People, it was like for the rest of that day, for the rest of that week really, the session, people were walking around with a sense of real pride and spring in their step, and there was almost a lightness and a gaiety and a joy by the senators that we had done the right thing, and we had sent a positive signal to the country by what we had done. And so that was a really good thing. Then, a couple of days later, I met Helms. It was during that same week I was getting on the elevator.
Oh,
The elevator story, yeah. Getting on the elevator, and Orrin Hatch, as it turned out, who was a very amenable guy. I mean, I got along with Orrin Hatch fine. He was different on the issues, but Orrin Hatch and Chris Dodd were on the elevator. And elevator door opened, and Jesse Helms starts to get on. And he says to Orrin, I'm going to make her cry. I'm gonna sing Dixie till she cries. And just instinctively, I just responded, Senator, you could sing Rock of Ages and I would cry. Well, it must have been Chris Dodd that went to the papers, I'm not sure, but whoever it was, it became a little blurb in the Washington Press, and of course that became the joke of the country. So now Helms is doubly mad at me. And he proceeded to, back to your right-wing conspiracy statement, he proceeded to make me an object of his fundraising. I actually saw him on television one time saying, yes, and she had her hands in the cookie jar. I mean, just awful stuff. Things that you would not do to a colleague under any circumstance, I mean, as a senator. Just beyond the pale. But, that was the kind of, I have no problem saying he was just a nasty old man. And proof positive the good die young. How's that on the record?
Good to me.
But yeah, so that was he became my nemesis. But in a funny way, nemesis in a way that everything he did actually kind of came out okay for me, because it was his efforts to stop my confirmation that brought to light a lot of the documentary evidence that, in terms of campaign finances and all the other garbage that had been thrown at me, it had to be documented because he sent out subpoenas in an effort to stop. Well, actually, go back. I'll tell the whole story. When I was nominated for ambassador, and by President Clinton. After I had lost re-election, President Clinton nominated me as ambassador to New Zealand, and but Helms wouldn't call my nomination. Also unheard of. And so this cub reporter from Roll Call came over, the newspaper came over and asked, well, why hasn't your nomination been called? And I said, well, don't ask me. Ask the senator from the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. And of course the tongues had already started wagging. Oh, there must be something wrong. She hasn't been confirmed yet. And so Helms responded to the cub reporter, I'm not calling her nomination until she apologized for what she did to the Confederate flag. So the kid went back and printed this. And all of Washington was horrified, of course. And so he was forced to call my nomination. Then his next statement was, okay, I'm going to give her a hearing, but she won't get confirmed because she's got legal and ethical baggage. And that's when he sent out the 6 subpoenas. And sending out the 6 subpoenas was the best thing could have happened, because even things I didn't even know about that were in the file, that were the exculpatory, exoneration, or whatever you want to call it, vindication, things came out. I didn't know, for example, $311 was all the FEC found, wonky on terms of the campaign finances. We had over-reimbursed somebody. I didn't know that until Helms' subpoenas came back. So it turned out to be a good thing, and I got a 98-2 vote on confirmation, and off to New Zealand.
Which was paradise,
Which
right?
was paradise. Which was paradise. Which saved me.
Talk a little bit about that experience. We know that it was an exciting period in your life. We know the New Zealanders loved you, that you became an honorary Maori, and all kinds of good things. How did you talk a little bit about the background? Were you interested in New Zealand as a place? How do you get to be an ambassador?
I knew nothing about New Zealand, and this is kind of a Hillary Clinton story also,
Okay.
because it was her idea. At least I'm told it was her idea. I had no idea that there was an opening, a vacancy in New Zealand for an ambassadorship. Some of my Pakistani friends wanted me to be ambassador to Pakistan, and actually started a petition drive to have me be ambassador to Pakistan. But New Zealand was available, and so I did the homework before I went. I hadn't had a previous interest in that part of the world, didn't really know anything about it. But I did my homework, I studied. It turns out that the Chicago Field Museum has one of the only maraes outside of New Zealand in location in the world. And so we have in Chicago one of the foremost experts on not just New Zealand but that part of the world. And in fact, the marae in Chicago is called Ruateipapuke, and it's one of the only ones. There are two, I think, outside of New Zealand, one in Germany. And so I went down to the field, and I'm on one of the committees there anyway, and went down and got the information and the schooling and the books and all the rest. So I did my homework, and then went there, and in a funny way, you always try to play out your last battle. And so one of the things I did, I worked so hard as ambassador there, and got around to the whole country, largely because I wanted people to see that I was, the United States was not just sending them a problem child, but rather someone who was genuinely interested in the country and genuinely interested in making sure the relations between our nations were good ones. And that's what I did, and I worked very hard, but it was all so worth it. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience.
How long were you there?
2 years.
2 years. 2 years.
2 years, and in that time was able to, again, recover. And the other thing, the relevance of New Zealand in that experience to what I did when I came home was New Zealand is on its second woman prime minister. Both political parties have had a woman, both the Conservatives as well as the Labor Party. Its Supreme Court Justice is a woman. It's now, she was not in place when I was there, but the Governor General is now a woman. And so they have women in place, and they're very proud of the fact women got the vote in New Zealand like 8 years before we did here in the United States.
And they're a nuclear-free zone.
A nuclear-free zone. Yeah, it was paradise on every front. It just couldn't have been nicer. And so seeing women in positions in politics, particularly, women in the cabinet, women in the parliament. There was, the society was totally integrated with women, with Maoris. They didn't have the race issue that we have here. They have issues of income, but politicians there care about income inequality. I mean, it was a dream for someone who had been involved with policy all these years. And so seeing that as part of the New Zealand experience, then to come back home, find business as usual here, was really largely what inspired my decision to run for president.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? You had never thought about it before?
I really hadn't, and in fact, I was going, Ruth. I was going to go and restore my family farm in Alabama, and that was my first plan. When I came back home, because New Zealand is so agricultural, my family has had a farm since 1870. And the last of the relatives who lived there died just as I was coming back home. So I had all this, literally, I went out and we took farm experts and looked at the soil and what I could do, and I had, working up a business plan to actually go into a type of agriculture. And then September 11th happened. And when September 11th happened, I had been teaching over at one of the colleges there. And just instinctively, I went over, and the president of the college and I walked the grounds to try to console the kids and bring some order to the situation, because everybody, a lot of kids from New York and the like, it was awful.
Which college was this?
Morris Brown, and Dolores Cross was the president there. And we walked around and talked to the kids, and I wound up giving an impromptu speech in the gymnasium to the assembled students. And then in the following days, obviously all of us focused laser-like on what was going on, and watching our politics develop and watching the response of our government and then, following what's the Democratic response going to be, and saying to myself, these guys are not getting it, in my opinion. I mean, there were large, at that time, with the exception of Howard Dean, all of the Democratic candidates, well, no, Howard Dean and Bob Graham were the only two
That's right.
who had not supported the decision to go to war in Iraq. And so I just kind of, at that point, people back home in Chicago were encouraging me to come back to Chicago and run for office again, to run for the Senate again, to run for this, run for that. And I had, been there, done that, literally. Was not inclined to get embroiled in, Democratic Party fight over whether or not I'd be the Senate nominee. It just didn't make any sense to me to do that. The Senate had been such a hideous time in my life anyway. And so I said, I've got this in place. And so I started thinking about it myself, but of course it was almost too big of an idea for anybody to respond to. And I remember, this is a very true story, which Claire, I hope, will never fail to tell her children. My little niece is 11. And we were sitting around in the kitchen talking with her father about politics and about the fact that some folks have been talking to me about, what about a presidential run? My brother was, oh, no, you don't want to do that. Go back to the Senate. You can win your Senate seat. My brother had a point of view.
This is your brother's daughter.
My brother's daughter, Claire.
Mm-hmm.
In the middle of the conversation, she'd come, Auntie Carol, come quick. So I went to her room thinking there was a problem, and she's sitting there with her social studies book open to a page that had all the presidents. And she looked at me and said, Auntie Carol, all the presidents are boys. She was, she just, how can this be? Where are the girl presidents? She didn't get it. She didn't understand. All the presidents are boys. And I said, well, Claire, that's right. All the presidents have been boys. I said, but a girl can be president if she wants to. So that kind of satisfied her. And I went back in the kitchen. I was just chuckling. And I told my brother the all the president are boys story. And we got into a little family exchange. Well, that just kind of kept nagging at me and nagging at me. And I thought, well, I can go out here much in the same way the Senate race happened. I can go out here. I can stand up for what I believe in. I can make a point. I can give people a point of view that I think is a positive one. And I can make certain that girls like Claire will see that girls can be president too. That people, Americans, will see that girls have something to offer. And I can make a statement just by my candidacy. Just by being a candidate, it will help to move this agenda that I've fought for all my life. And so it was like the pieces just kind of click, 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 click came together. And once that happened, I was real clear about what I should do. Then the problem came, could I do it? Which is another set of issues.
Where did the biggest support come from? Because I remember when Shirley Chisholm did this in 1972, and of course we haven't had anyone since then, really. I mean, Pat Schroeder gave it a bit of a try, and Elizabeth Dole, and they pulled back. I think you stayed in longer than both Pat and Senator Dole. Shirley Chisholm, it was a different moment. She stayed all the way to the floor, but those were in the days when you took some delegates to the floor and traded, and now, of course, the primary system has changed that, so we've really selected the nominee before. But in that moment, in 1972, there was so much excitement about women in politics. The feminist movement was in full force, which you can't say was true in 2004. And the women's community, and it's been written up, was very split because they wanted to go with someone who was going to win because they wanted to have some leverage, they wanted to have something to take to the table, and at the same time here was this woman who was running and they wanted to support her too. And they were torn, the Democratic women. What happened this time?
Well, it was several things. And there's one more aspect of this that can't be overlooked, and that is that we were in the middle of a war. And the whole idea that a woman can't speak to issues of security, which again, we can have another conversation about that, but the whole security issue, both domestic as well as international. The good thing about, one of the things that gave me, again, a platform was because I had international experience. I had actually more international experience than any of the men I mean, the general has a different kind of experience, but as a diplomat, having done that and having traveled extensively, so I could hold my own with them in terms of international exposure. I could hold my own with them as a policymaker, having served not only in the Senate but in state and local government, which was another whole thing. So on the credential side of the equation, it was all going on. The downside was being both black and female, and actually not even in that order, being female and black, or black and female in that order. It came together. Remember I said that intersectionality can mitigate for you or against you, and in this case, the intersectionality mitigated in a way that would have tubed the effort regardless, I think. I mean, we stayed as long as we could, and it was a fabulous experience, don't get me wrong, and I want to talk about why it was such a wonderful thing. But that, I think, just meant it was in that regard doomed from the beginning. But nonetheless, important to do. Important on several levels. The support, you say, the nice thing was that there were women's organizations, like the National Organization of Women, National Women's Political Caucus, who were willing to beard the lion, literally, and say, we're going to stand pat on wanting to see a woman in this race. That the days when there can be a presidential campaign on the Democratic Party side and have no woman at all, when we just take the back seat or take low, when we have talent to contribute or something to say, those days are over. So I think the fact that they were willing to step up and do that was very important. They took some heat for it. I mean, the New York Times wrote a nasty editorial saying how silly they were being and this, that, and the other. But, by the way, the New York Times never even bothered to give me an editorial board interview. I've qualified for more ballots than any woman in history, and I did not get an interview with the editorial board at the New York Times, our nation's leading newspaper.
Did all the other Democratic primary
them.
candidates?
All of them.
All of them except
Al
you?
Sharpton twice. Right. So yeah, it's
Not
pretty
astonishing,
pretty
I guess.
shocking. Pretty shocking. But anyway, but those women's groups were prepared to step forward. There were women such as a woman down in Florida, who literally, I mean, we were able to pay her expenses, but she came up and volunteered her time, full time, to help put it together, out of a commitment to seeing women involved and included in our political processes. The little fundraising we were able to do, and of course it was the money in the end that really just killed us. We couldn't raise the money. But people responded to me personally based on the fact that they had seen me do it before. You know, it's kind of the old, we've done it before, we'll do it again, and you know, sit on the sidelines and be surprised if you want to. But so there were people who contributed out of a sense of, yeah, this is an important voice that ought to be heard, and I think it did make a difference. It made a difference in the issues that got raised. It made a difference in the way that the issues were debated. One of my favorite moments from the campaign was at a debate in which the question of the draft, whether or not women should be drafted, came up. And all the fellows said, yes, women should be drafted, women should be drafted. I said, well, you know, I wouldn't have a problem with drafting women if women weren't subject to violence in the military and weren't being raped at the academies. Which, as you know, is an issue that nobody wanted to talk about in these war times. But that is a real problem. And so it was that sort of thing that made a difference, I think, in terms of the way the debates happened and the way the conversation developed. And while it wasn't enough to take us over the top, and as you know, the Democratic Party lost to George Bush for a variety of reasons, but at the same time, I think that it really did help us break through and to set up what I think I called a positive resonance in the American people about where, in the American political conversation about where the Democrats were and would likely do if elected.
You know,
So-
it's just to reinforce that, it's a good news, bad news comment, but, I mean, it's sort of appalling, but I have to report it, but any number of times during that primary period when you were part of the lineup and one of the candidates who appeared in these debates on television. Now, we're talking about who watches those. It's political junkies for the most part who turn on C-SPAN and watch all of these debates. I can't tell you, among these political junkies, I encountered how many people said to me, oh, I'm very impressed with Carol Moseley Braun. She did, and it was said, both good news, very impressive performance. Bad news, why are they saying this? That it's still in 2004 sort of surprising to people that a woman knows how to walk and talk at the same time and have a thought and have some knowledge and get into something like that. And there's no question that that reaction, I think, was underlying some of that surprise.
I think that's right. And the good news, and I came away from the whole thing inspired by the experience, largely because I experienced that divide also in a way that among the political class, the political junkies, there was this A, surprise that a woman could even dare have the temerity to do it. B, who does she think she is? She has not been anointed or called by any of us to do this. And so you ran into brick wall after brick wall, and has she lost her mind? Is she crazy? I mean, a lot of that on that side. Among the people, however, there was a much more genuine receptivity. I heard more often than not, well, it's time for a woman. The men have messed it up, it's time for a woman. I mean, I had people, farmers in overalls in Iowa, come up to me and say, young lady, I didn't know about you before this, but you'd make a fine president. So, for me to be able to go around places and see people willing to overcome both race and gender and give me a hearing, whether they thought I could win or not. And interestingly, I wish I had the money to hang in till Iowa, I'll tell you, because I had more than one person come and say, oh, we wish you had stayed in. We were prepared to caucus for you. We were prepared to caucus for you in Iowa. We wish you had stayed in till it got to our state. I mean, so I ran into that among the people outside of the political class much more than I did among the so-called experts. And that, I think, really left me feeling very good about the direction this country is headed on the issue of gender and on the issue of race.
Let me add another optimistic note here. We are so thrilled here that you did this and stayed in the race, and we have such evidence in the young people, many of whom you'll be meeting later on in your visit
Great.
here. I teach a class called the Leadership Scholars class. Several of those students will be here. In fact, they competed for places during various parts of your calendar today. They wanted to be able to meet you. But the very fact that you were there, I think, for these young women, made it possible for them to imagine
That's it.
the future. And I think that's so critically important. One of the things that surprised me when I go out and talk about women in leadership, I ask groups, what percentage of people in a Gallup poll in 2001 do you think said that they would vote for a woman candidate for president? Well, the answer was 92%. But the students, even rather well-informed students, will say 10%, 20%. Even now, when they think it's at least a possibility, they have no idea that there's such a large group of people who are willing to tell the Gallup folks anyway that they would
Right.
vote for a woman
Right.
candidate. And I think it's partly been the whole war situation and the way those guys conducted the campaign to make it almost unimaginable that a woman could run for president, or goodness knows that women could even, get out there and vote. It's been a very discouraging time, but you were a bright light in all of that.
Thank you. Well, it's also a matter of being able to visualize it. I go back to Claire, Auntie Carol, all the presidents are boys. The American, particularly those of us of a certain age, when you get to that, to the post, the 70, 80 people born in the 1980s, for them it's less difficult to conceive of a woman being president. I mean, Claire was shocked that there hadn't been. For those of us over of a certain age, if you will, it's difficult to conceive a woman as president. And again, particularly a black one. Remember, our generation went through the civil rights movement, went through the women's rights. We were part of the struggle that created the reality that these kids now take for granted. Mm-hmm. Having created that reality, we still are carrying some of the baggage from the old days of our own mindset. And the mindset says, well, okay, black people just got integrated into the society at all. It's a real leap for me to imagine one as president. women just came out of the house, out of the home. It's a real leap for me to imagine her as chief executive of the greatest country in the world. I mean, and so it is really a matter of perception and perspective and the ability to visualize that really kept me going on the days when I was really, really, really tired, because campaigning is the most rigorous thing for president. It's the most rigorous thing you can imagine. It is truly an endurance test. It is something that is physically taxing, more than I ever imagined. But having done it, I now know that people will be less surprised to see a woman candidate for president. People will be less surprised to see an African American candidate for president. And people and the political class will become kicking and screaming to join up with where the people are.
On the basis of what you've just said, I am drawing the conclusion that you're an optimist about what is likely to happen in the future. And yet, I think some of us who are looking at the political scene right now can understand the young people who say, oh, it's so awful out there. Can you really make a difference?
Yeah.
Or is politics the arena where the most difference can be made when they're making choices about their lives and what directions?
And that's a
they
hard
will
one,
go?
because it is nasty. I mean, you know, if it hadn't been for New Zealand, I'd probably be, you know, in a padded cell right now somewhere. You know, it is nasty and it's hard. But again, as I said, kind of off the record, for me, it is an expression of my love of country, of my own patriotism, because it is a sacrifice. Yes, it's horrible, it's nasty. It's ugly. It will, you know, destroy you, or can destroy you if you're not careful and lucky. But it's something that has to be done if we are going to keep faith with the sacrifice that brought us this far. If we're going to keep this country on track, you know, again, everybody's got their own worldview, and it may be a function of ego as much as anything else, that you say my worldview is the correct one. But if you are going to express that worldview, then there truly is no better arena in which to do that than in politics. And so the fact that it takes such perseverance to get through the ugliness of it is something that women have to understand is just part and parcel of the contribution they're being called on to make. It's harder sometimes for women to volunteer to go into somebody's alley, you know. And as you point out, women often have to be asked. And even if asked, having looked down the alley and seen what's there, a lot of women will say, oh, well, you know, the delicate side of me doesn't want to have to bear that. Oh, I'm sorry, I hit my microphone. The delicate side of me doesn't want to have to take that on. My response to that is, but if you don't take it on, then who will? Or if you don't take it on, will that mean it won't be taken on at all? And the progress that we've seen and that we believe has been woefully inadequate and slow will be even more inadequate and slower. And so you have to contribute, you have to get in there if you're going to continue to move this country in the direction that I believe is central to its most fundamental values and ideals. And that the goodness of this country, of America, is that we start off with the notion that individuals have a role to play in self-governance. And that has inspired people all over the world. And it is with that as a foundation that all of us are called, I think, to move it in the direction of actually realizing that ideal. It wasn't the case when the Constitution was written. You know, women couldn't vote, blacks were slaves, and even if they weren't slaves, couldn't vote. Poor people couldn't vote, couldn't participate. But the whole of American history has been about moving in the direction of giving life to those ideals. And we are challenged in our time to take that next step in the direction of the inclusion and integration of women, minorities, of all people, into the whole of American society. And that means its policy leadership as well.
That's beautifully expressed and
Thank you.
wonderful. It is the vision.
What about Carol Moseley Braun? What's next for her?
That was mine too. You must end this by telling us. I know you're planning to go and open a shop, and the next thing we know, you'll be running the UN or something. But,
Well, no, I'm still called to agriculture.
You're going to the farm.
I'm going to the farm. Going to the farm. So
For the time being.
no, I mean I'm excited about it. Providing healthy food for people is a good thing, and that's still a way of contributing, and it's a way of giving back. And it's particularly in these times. Don't get me started on my agriculture speech, okay? But but I'm
you know what
excited
you
by it.
remind me? Voltaire, who managed to overturn most of Europe, said that he was just going to cultivate his garden. And maybe that's the sort of thing you're going to do. You say you're just going to be cultivating
My
your garden. It'll turn out to be the world.
Oh, well, listen, that's a wonderful, thank you for putting me in such august company, but yeah, no, I'm looking to do agriculture, and that's what I'm.
Does this mean you're moving to Alabama?
No, we okay, you want to get the speech, here we go. I'm getting involved in what's called biodynamic or organic agriculture, and it's a way of creating healthy food that also restores the earth, the soil in which it's grown, and so it becomes a cycle. And we're looking at doing a company, and I've been having meetings and putting together the financing, and I'll use the farm. The farm can be part of the base out of which this operation takes place, but I can do it with the technologies. I can do it out of Chicago just as easily. So
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you. I'm
Look
very
forward to
excited
hearing
about
what happens with that and to eating the food.
It's healthier for you. It tastes better.
I'm always looking for that kind of food and reminding my daughter that she's got to feed it to her children.
Well, that's right. And I'll tell you something, particularly given the kind of nutritional problems that our young people are having, and I mean, I should talk about obesity, but the issue of obesity among young people, and well, all the disease processes that come from the fact that our diet is so out of balance. The biodynamic agriculture, I think, holds great promise in this country, and people are expressing a preference for organic foods, and so I think that as that grows, it just provides more and more opportunity to do neat stuff.
That's great.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.